Our webinar today, Spotlight on Documentum D2, What's New and What's Next. The presentation is going to be approximately 45 minutes long, followed by a question and answer session. All participant lines will remain mute during the event. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the questions box on your control panel. You may submit a question at any time, however, it will not be answered until the end of the presentation. Before we begin the presentation, I'm going to quickly run through the agenda. Next slide, please. All right. First, Patrick McGrath, ECM Product Marketing Manager from EMC, will discuss why D2 and how it can help your organization. He'll then cover new D2 features. Next, Frank Dantrone, President of FME US, will review frequently asked questions about D2, discuss how D2 helps life sciences companies, and review the D2 extension model. Frank will also discuss migrating to D2 and share FME's experience working with life sciences and financial services customers. Lastly, I'll review some upcoming events, and then we'll go into our Q&A session. Patrick, it's all yours.
He says scrambling for the mute button, unmute button. So thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your time this morning, and thanks to Enchoice and FME for inviting me on the call. So we're going to talk about several aspects of the really focusing on the new features that D2 are bringing in. But first, let's move ahead and start talking about the situation that we're faced with. So in general, we've got a greater set of demanding customers from our business offices and from IT. And users, of course, are getting more and more acclimatized to dealing with consumer-based apps, right? So they want faster, better, cheaper. They want more control. They want their documents to be managed in a place that's trustworthy and so on. But agility is a really big deal. They want the ability to be able to get, in terms of users, want the ability to start decreasing their reliance on IT so they can do stuff for themselves. And of course, IT is really interested in driving down the costs of providing these kinds of solutions. So if we could go to the next slide. So primarily when we looked at the kinds of problems that we typically address with content, there's a few different scenarios that we typically see. And the first is the content library. And this is the one that we're really talking about here for D2 primarily. A content library is the kind of classic way of taking a look at a document collection where you've got folders and documents and so on. And generally, when you're interacting with a content library, your actions are very much driven by sort of what you want to find, and you're doing research, and maybe you know where the document may be, but it's something that you're really very much directing the interaction with the system. That's kind of different than a custom application or a content application, where an application is much more likely to be driving you to the next step of some sort of transaction in a very sort of orchestrated way. And for those kind of use cases, you could use D2, but we actually have a more appropriate option perhaps with XCP for that kind of use case. Next slide, please. So D2 has been around for a few years, and we really kind of feel that D2 meets those business challenges that we're facing a lot with that content library scenario. So many of you who may have seen it before will be very familiar that from an end user's perspective, we're dealing with a workspace that's very dependent upon sort of the role or the function that you play, and it's a very personalizable space. So you can move different parts of the library interface around to suit your working style, and obviously have access to a library of widgets which are effectively different functions or views of documents or metadata or geographic representations and so on. And you can drag those into your workspace based on what makes you the most productive, right? So we've kind of got this idea here for end users of a role-specific workspace, but heavily personalizable based on the kind of content and working style that you have. And you know, on the other side, for the IT folks, we have a significant degree of compliance and agility business rules that we can kind of create and reuse those rules across multiple workspaces and multiple different types of library activities. So obviously we might have an IT person that's actually setting up specific business rules. We could have a business analyst doing that, but the work that they're doing to configure for specific types of documents can actually be reused across multiple iterations of new workspaces as they need to by the business offices themselves. Next slide, please. So, next slide. There we go. So, obviously, one of the biggest things here that we want to be able to provide in a content library solution is we really need to be able to make employees able to find the right kind of content and to be able to glean meaning from it as quickly as possible. So we have a personalized space where we're able to use D2 with searches and facets, and we'll talk a little bit more about the facets later on, and combined with preview tools and so on, so you can actually zone in on the information that you're looking for very quickly. And then you're able to see the documents and all of the associated information about the documents, maybe the audit trails for them, maybe the metadata that's been assigned to them, maybe the documents themselves in a preview mode. So it's, the whole idea there is get folks to the content very quickly and make it very, very consumable. Next slide, please. Did we slip over the... Yeah, there we go. So we've also got a lot of streamlined team collaboration. So from within that D2 workspace, when you're taking a look at a document, it's very, very easy to start saying, you know what, I need to be able to send documents in a collaboration mode or an acknowledgement mode to other folks in my organization so that they can review and maybe annotate the documents. Of course, all the time protecting each user's comments, right? So rather than just having a file share with a bunch of documents, Documentum and D2 will provide you with a way to make that a very controlled and auditable process, all right? So it's a way of being able to provide that consistent behavior of the documents relative to the kinds of needs that that part of the organization has. Next slide, please. The configuration that we talked about in one of the previous slides is a really important thing. So we've got the ability to create a set of rules in a centralized fashion about particular document types or particular treatments of those documents. And establishing those rules kind of gives you, you know, a measure of control and standardization that can then actually be applied to where those documents might be consumed in various parts of how you've set your content library up. So the great thing is it's kind of the configure once and then you apply it to a set of common business scenarios, and that's something that a business analyst is able to do, which inherits all of those basic behaviors, including management of the document lifecycle and any audit requirements and so on that are met. Next slide, please. We also provide in D2 the ability to control things like copying and printing and viewing of documents depending upon the role of the user themselves. Some folks may only be able to see a PDF rendition rather than the original document itself, and maybe that's watermarked to indicate its status, whether that be draft or approved or archived. So those document properties can automatically be synced with Office documents to avoid sort of that manual copying that often introduces errors. Next slide, please. All right, yes. Deliver the value and speed of process. Sorry, let's go back one. Great. So one of the really big things about D2 is the speed at which new functionality can be deployed to the business community. So once you've effectively got D2 deployed, where you've got business analysts who can work with users to configure the application, to define the rules for those kinds of documents, and apply it to their particular environment, whether that be behaviors that are applied inside, for example, a workspace that's oriented towards HR documents or financial documents or building inspection reports, whatever that may be. And so each of those business units can have unique functionality or the unique combination of functionality that it needs, but they still benefit from those global rules. Okay, next slide. So the strategic themes that we have for D2 are all around these three areas. So the first one is productivity. So what we want to be able to do is to make it really easy to get in and find the right content and do what you need with that content as quickly as possible. We want to make it really easy to reuse or repurpose existing content you have with a very, very friendly and contemporary user interface. And we really want to make it easy to facilitate that kind of controlled collaboration around that content authoring and approval process that hopefully makes that, from a knowledge worker perspective, so much easier to deal with and quicker. Information integrity is all about making sure that we are managing that content with the kind of behavior consistently across the organization. So one of the things that we often find from older systems is that, depending upon how you access that content, you may have different business rules applied, but D2 actually makes sure that those business rules for a particular document are very consistent. And of course, in doing that, you're actually able to make sure that the latest of those procedures and policies are followed, rather than having older and out-of-date processes that are governing that quickly kind of start reducing your trust in the integrity of the content itself. And obviously the last one, for agility, we really want to be able to reduce the time to get value to our business users who are in a real bind often with their own time to value. So we need to be able to empower them more and get them running faster. Next slide, please. So in terms of the new features around D2 4.5 that was released a couple months ago, really the largest investment that we've made is around that productivity area. So for users, this is a big functional release that we think is going to please a lot of organizations. Movement in a very, very good direction. So I'm not going to go through these ones in detail here, but I'm actually going to talk about some highlights over the next several slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first group that we're going to talk about are the productivity areas. Next slide. So the first thing is that we've actually updated the user experience quite a bit to modernify. Is that a word? People can object on the GoToMeeting widget. But really we're using a very modern visual design approach. We've got a user experience team at EMC that does some really great work in this space. The features for 4.5 are really kind of dealing with those tab styling updates. We've got widget containers and accordion style updates so that you can basically collapse a section of the D2 screen if you need to. We've changed fonts and icons, and generally there's sort of a flatter look and feel, much more modern. Next slide. So one of the big features that I just absolutely love is the idea of the faceted search and the way that it makes the consumption of content so much easier. So the idea of facets is kind of like, I'm not sure how many of you use Amazon. I'm addicted to it. But this provides you with a way of being able to search a catalog for televisions, for example, and then you'll notice in Amazon on the left-hand side there'll be a whole series of different facets that come up to say, do you want OLED or LCD? Do you want the price range of this or that? You know, is there a list of manufacturers that I can take a look at? So you're effectively providing, from a basic search, a way then to be able to drill down very quickly into the kinds of identification that provides you, you know, getting to your content as quickly as possible. So what we've found in folks that have actually adopted this is that it produces a huge productivity increase to those that are trying to really get to that right kind of content. And of course, in doing so, we have these breadcrumbs here so that you can actually kind of see what facets you've turned on and turned off. And to actually enable the facets is an incredibly easy process for a business analyst to go in, and they can configure you know, what that search experience looks like and what facets are activated. And you'll see here in an example that you know, somebody who's searching for HR documents could actually go down and take a look at specific date ranges and say, hey, I'm only looking for something that was updated last week. And they'll see that there are 5 documents there. So it's a very, very productive experience. Next slide. The next area is faster document approvals with multi-document support. This is a really good one. So in previous versions of D2, you know, we had one document is sort of one approval. So if you were saying, right, well, I've got these 5 contract documents and I want to be able to make sure that somebody's reviewed and approved those things, you would actually send 5 separate tasks. And those 5 separate tasks would all have one document associated with it. So now you'd actually be able to bundle up all 5 documents under a single approval request, and then somebody can approve that task basically with those 5 documents there. And that actually would create those approval actions and acknowledgements against the documents themselves. So it's a great way of being able to make the approval process and so on much more productive. Next slide, please. So we've also introduced a graphical workflow display widget. And so if you are actually doing something where in D2 you've taken a look at your library, you've found the kind of content you want, and you want to start initiating a particular workflow, there's a widget that you can actually just pull from the widget library and put on your desktop, and you'd actually be able to see from that some sort of graphical representation of where you actually are in that workflow. And we've found that to be something that's very useful for people that are really trying to make sense of you know, why they haven't received full approval for a document, for example. They can track back to figure out where that process is. Next slide, please. This is a very popular one too, which is the ability to you know, have additional integration between a Word document and the annotations that you may be making with, for example, your track changes, and the D2 and Documentum system catalog. So you know, when you're creating your document, you're actually able to take a look at the document and check it in. Somebody else is taking a look at it, they go and edit that thing, they can put in some comments, and what Documentum D2 will do will be able to extract those annotations and actually put those annotations in a widget so that you don't actually have to go in and preview the document itself. You could actually go in and see the fact that various annotations have been made and to be able to view those in D2 rather than having to open up the documents in preview mode. Next slide. We've also increased for Windows the ability to do more drag and drop from your desktop into D2 libraries and vice versa. And that seems like a fairly trivial thing to think about, but it actually has a really big impact on people that are sort of reworking collections of content and being able to make sure that they can assemble quickly the kind of collections that they need to for their processing requirements. So really, we find that this sort of drag and drop approach actually really reduces training time too for people because it's much more intuitive. Next slide, please. And of course, as you're maintaining your tasks lists in D2, you know, we've now enabled the out of office kind of mode here, where you can actually say, right, well, you know, I've got 10 tasks that I need to perform. I've had a quick desire to go to Tahiti, and I've got the ability here to be able to reassign those tasks that were in my inbox to somebody else while that's happening. So you're effectively not letting things fall through the cracks from that perspective. Next slide. The last one, it's kind of hard to think about as a productivity feature for an end user, but the box function is what we call branch office caching services. And this is actually a way to make sure that if you've got a central repository in New York, that your users in Dusseldorf, in Germany, for example, could actually have cached documents in a repository running in their location, and they wouldn't need to worry about the performance constraints of their wide area network. They'd actually be able to quickly get hold of that content and then have it synchronized later. So that's a productivity perspective in terms of what it'll take you to access that content and deal with it. Next one. So next we're talking about the integrity aspects. So in D2 4.5 we've enabled the Simplicity Documentum connector 1.1 support. Now this is actually a really great thing because we typically see D2 implemented in terms of an intranet type application, and using Simplicity, which is a file sync and share mode, actually gives people mobile or you know, handheld support for documents. So typically you'll see the file sync and share model sort of dealing in a standalone thing if I just want to share files, but actually implementing this connector with something like D2 really provides you with the deep ECM functionality from that mobile standpoint. And of course we've got a number of folks that are actually saying, you know, I've got a core set of documents, I can make that available, make those documents available to my field staff. My field staff can actually annotate that on their iPads from wherever, whatever location they're in, and they can synchronize that back and get updates to those documents that then get checked in and managed with the full sort of auditability that you would expect from an enterprise content management system. Next slide. Okay, we talked about the simplicity one. Could we go next? So the next one, something that may not matter as much to the business community, but IT, expanded single sign-on support. So we have a series of these other providers which actually will create an easier experience where people don't have to sign on if they've already used a single sign-on mode. They can go straight into D2 into their default workspace. And this is particularly useful for some of the intelligent URLs that we'll talk about in a minute too. Next slide, please. We also provide the cross-repository search. So in other words, if you have multiple repositories configured for your D2, you have the ability to be able to, from one repository, do searches on another repository and being able to sort of reuse and share and copy and paste and so on that content really provides a lot greater control for those organizations that have a multiple repository configuration. Next slide, please. One of the big challenges that we often faced with D2 was, you know, when you're putting content into a D2 through D2 to Documentum, you know, a lot of the time you're dealing with, you know, dragging the documents and it wouldn't really sort of inherit the folder structures. So now what we're able to do is actually import complete folder trees, and that kind of quickly converts those folders inside Documentum to a virtual document, but you actually kind of get that flavor of a deep folder import, and that dramatically reduces time to actually start ingesting content from other sources like file shares or other repositories and so on. Next slide. Again, with virtual documents, we've been able to easily create virtual documents. So, for example, if you were dealing with a contract that had many separate components, those components could be managed under their own collaboration and audit rules. So you'd have the ability effectively using enhanced functionality here to have a whole series of sub-documents managed underneath what we call a virtual document, and so you could send the customer the virtual document but have the contract assembly, if you like, managed for the elementary ones underneath it. So this actually really allows organizations to accelerate their D2 adoption by relying on sort of a repeatable information structure. So even if the components get updated, it's still the same kind of structure that you could be sending out for somebody else to consume. And of course, it enables the team to be managed sort of a reusable template of what that information structure or what that virtual document structure would look like, which effectively cuts down the time and cost for that kind of assembly, which is, in some use cases, a really big deal. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about the D2 intelligent URLs. We've enhanced this quite a bit so that, for example, if you provide somebody with the URL for a D2 document, it will automatically go to that document. If you've got a single sign-on, you don't have to go effectively through the user interface of D2 to get hold of that document. We have methods here of being able to make sure that if somebody's after a particular document, you may have sent them a link to a version 3 of a document, but the intelligent URL would actually pop up a dialog and say, you know what, there's a version 4 and a version 5 document that's out there now. Do you want one of those instead? So this actually creates a lot of not only productivity increases, but integrity issues to make sure that people are getting the right kind of content that they need in the most up-to-date version. Okay, and let's talk about agility for a second. Next slide. So we also have, yeah, thank you. We actually also have a much faster onboarding of users. So we can actually import those users with a series of templates, for example. It gives you a much more streamlined user management experience, dealing with things like corporate directories and so on. You know, you can pre-configure their profiles and then just let that rip. So you're really kind of getting that user information in there as quickly as possible so that the users are able to do their work faster. And the next slide. We also have upgraded quite significantly for the IT folks ways to be able to do more reporting and comparison on D2 configuration plugins and specifications. So it's much more easy now to report and provide technical specs for the configuration that may be in place, and you could take a look, for example, if you were looking to migrate or to do some change analysis between two systems like a staging system and a production system. You'd actually be able to do that kind of delta analysis, find whatever discrepancies or changes are there, and quickly validate those things. So from an IT perspective, that's really, really important. So with that, Frank, I'd like to pass it over to you to talk about some of the experiences that you've had as a partner dealing with Documentum D2.
Sure. Well, Patrick, thanks. That was great primer, really setting the stage for me on the segment that I'm going to cover now. And before I dig into my slides, I just wanted to, you mentioned a number of things that are valuable items, but just one that I know that I'm not going to touch on in my segment is the box. We have implemented with a few of our customers box for global applications in a very successful way, so that for those who are considering that, quite a good approach in terms of global implementations and for managing content in a global way. So just wanted to touch on that. It's kind of stood out to me. I just wanted to highlight that. So here is a classic slide. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and of course EMC's simplicity is far, far superior, but carry on, Frank.
I would agree. Thank you. So here I wanted to mention this slide here because it's sort of the classic story, right? You have applications out there where, over the years, and I've been, in this space around Documentum since 1998, so I've seen quite the transformation within the Documentum community and application architecture. And what we're seeing is, in the past, sort of this 20% config and 80% traditional development, right? The classic story. But if we go to the next slide, again, conversely, you'll see it, it's quite the opposite. Really, what Patrick was showing from not just from a 4.5, just from a D2 perspective, the ability to configure applications to get that user experience is far superior in today's technology within the Documentum stack with D2 than it has been over the years. And to that point, even further, I'm going to talk a bit about the life science solutions themselves. I would say it's even further than the 80-20 because they're, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second here, but you'll see that be more in the 90 to 95%. There's always a little bit of configuration or maybe some special logic that a customer may need, but that 80-20 is more 90-10 or even 95-5. So let's dig into the next slide. So frequently asked questions, and there's a number of bubbles here, so we're going to tab through it, keep going. We'll get them all on the screen because I'm not going to talk about every single one of them given the time today. But the things that I wanted to put out there for those who may, that's good, thinking about, what are the minimum requirements, for example. What Java do I need? These are all a bit of technical points, but can I use WebTop and D2 together in the same environment, in the same repository? Can I, extend D2 beyond just the configurations that we've been talking about, because I have some special scenarios or special requirements that really need that type of extensibility, within the framework. Our TBOs, because I've invested a number of person days or implementation time on TBO work that has my special business logic, and I want to continue to leverage that investment. So these are really good questions. The answer is yes. And most of those that they are supported, there are ways, and I'm going to touch on a number of them throughout the course of the next slides that are coming. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to dig into life science. So what's the industry needs? So some of it's obvious, but as I said earlier, I've been in this technical space, in this within the Documentum community for a number of years, and I don't think this has changed, right? The needs of the business or the industries haven't changed. I think the technology has evolved and matured and to where we are today, so that's the good news. But I think the real necessity in the industry needs hasn't changed. Faster time to value, how can I get to a production, my applications deployed quicker, lower cost, trusted platform, is it cloud ready, are these, is the technology that I'm going to invest in, is it cloud ready, the third platform, if you will, of those who are, versed in EMC's model in terms of go-to-market and technology evolution. So these are the things that the Life Science Suite that I'm going to go through today really cover, because they're purpose-built solutions packaged, with the D2 core that Patrick covered, So when we get, I'll get into the next few slides where you'll kind of see how those things are bundled. So let's go into the next slide. So just a little bit more in terms of productivity and efficiency, secure, internal, external collaboration, personalized workspaces, things that Patrick mentioned in the core D2, but even further with the solutions themselves, it's even more segmented into different role-based users. They see what makes sense for their role within the application environment. The ability to automatically publish regulated content, especially in life science, the regulated content is a core element for publishing to the agencies for product approval, and really accelerating review. We think we looked a little bit at workflow and approval process, but that's pre-bundled, pre-packaged in the solutions based on industry standards, and I'm going to mention a few things on that in the up-and-coming slides. So we can go to the next slide. So from a life science perspective, there's 4 actually. Did we skip a slide? This is the right slide, I believe. Yeah, so life science is made up of these 3, and there's one that I'm going to touch on, and it's in a few slides coming, which is the submission viewer, the SSV module. But the 3 that I'm going to start with first, these have matured over the past few years. There's the ETMF, electronic trial master module, the R&D module, as well as the quality and manufacturing module. So I'm going to really highlight, given the time constraints for today, I'm really just going to touch on each of them, really give you just a general idea of what's possible within these different solutions, and then we're going to just have follow-up webinars where we'll dig into them in much more detail. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the solution suite is really made up of a number of layers, traditional stack diagram, whereas at the bottom, you have core documentum, the platform itself, the back end, the repository. That's sort of the foundation. Then you have the D2 core, what I call the core layer, which is what Patrick covered, D245, for example, which is the basis for the life sciences suite, the 4 release. That's where the D2 core is, on top of the D2 core, you have the solutions, which they're calling the unified layer. It's the solution layer. So you have these 3 different applications or solutions on top of the D2 layer, and each of them within themselves have various what EMC calls domains. So within the regulatory, for example, R&D, you have a non-clinical domain, a clinical domain, a quality domain, etc. Same with quality and manufacturing. There's these different domains, and within these different areas within the solutions, it's pre-bundled based on industry standards, best practice. So you have metadata property registration, so where you can populate repeatable metadata that gets cascaded to documents. So there's a lot of automation that's built in, that's baked into the solutions. And I'm going to highlight a little bit of that in the next couple of slides. So let's go to the next slide. So again, the purpose-built solutions, really having global control over the content, being able to share across the solutions. So for those who invest in, let's say, quality manufacturing and R&D, there is distinct separation in terms of business processes and content artifacts, but there is a mesh point between those 2 business areas where content is shared across those 2 solutions. So having, the suite itself enables customers to really have a single version of truth across the content repository. So leveraging the 2 application areas against those different artifacts in one place. And then as part of that, and then one other point, sorry, I should have told you to stay there. So we have, the basis of, and that's why you see the DIA, the Drug Information Association, the DIA reference model. There's the EDM and the ETMF. So these are industry standards. They've been in place for a number of years, and they're evolving and maturing. And EMC has adopted those standards to provide those purpose-built solutions based on those industry standards and best practices. So let's go to the next one. So quick highlights: quality manufacturing, really enabling to manage control documents, maintaining compliance, providing a user-friendly system, managing those manufacturing specific artifacts or processes such as executed records, ensuring proper change controls are met, distribute current effective documentation to global users. So again, this is highlights. There's far more capability, but given our time today, I just wanted to throw a few highlights out there, get people to think about it, start to think about what's your direction in terms of managing quality and manufacturing documents. Do you do this through traditional web top, implementation, or do you have DCM or other type of application environment? Start to consider Q&M as a replacement, prepackaged solution for that use case. So let's go to the next slide. R&D, research and development. The main point here is really the ability to create, review, and approve regulated submission content or documentation. At the end, you have various sources of content that needs to be assembled, within a submission process. So at the end, having, control and process around that content is critical, so that you're providing the single point of truth, the appropriate content to the agency, and have that auditability to prove and show that you have control over that content within your operating environment. And in addition to that, having the speed to document search. So as part of the solutions, they're pre-bundled again with a taxonomy, a metadata taxonomy that we might have mentioned. I think Patrick touched on a little bit. You have various faceted searches or prepackaged searches that is keyed off of the model. So everything is interconnected so that you can really contribute and consume content in a very effective way because of the harmonization of the models and the metadata within the application. So let's go to the next slide. An ETMF, this is around your electronic trial master file, improving your trial setup, quick assembly of that documentation. So setting up the appropriate trial information and having that cascade to the relevant documentation within the repository. For both, you have two types of studies. There's studies that are blinded, where they have very, very rigid controls over that information, and then unblinded. So this is all managed within the application environment, within the security layer and the configuration model. So let's go to the next one. And then I did mention the submission, store, and view, new module. So let's go to the next one. I just put a few highlights. So the submission, store, view enables you to store your submissions and communications. So you can easily access and view that correspondence, and the correspondence is connected to the submission within the repository. The ability to search and retrieve archived submissions and their associated documents, so that if there's an inquiry or an internal audit, if you will, you have that ability to do that quick search to get to the appropriate source content as needed. Again, at the end, you're really having the ability to streamline your ECTD viewing, prior to sending that to the agencies, and also it has the ability to import submissions in all three formats: ECTD, NIS, and paper format. So let's go to the next slide. So for those technology folks out there that are wanting to know a little bit more on what's possible when it comes to D2, enhancing D2. So there's a framework in place, of course. I'm highlighting at a very high level some areas for you to think about. For those who may know, this is maybe a refresher. For those who are not familiar, this may give you a good idea of what's possible. So having the ability to develop your own or create your own widgets. So this is more in the enhancing of D2. You have an Open Ajax hub. There's a JavaScript framework where you can create external web apps to embed within your D2 web application environment. Here's just a couple of examples. Toolbar displaying permissions, a special interface for permission management or for help. If you have and I mentioned that in one of the actions, where you can have a D2 set of D2 Java packages to create and configure D2 plugins that enable you to add custom actions where you can override existing D2 artifacts or services. For example, I mentioned just a second ago, being able to open your own help. If you want to have your own help material within the application, there's a quick way to do that. Having services where maybe you want to modify like a pre-checkout or a post-checkout or something of that nature. There's hooks in there where you can extend that capability for your special business logic. And lastly, building integrated solutions using the D2FS layer. That's the D2 Foundation Services. That's because for those who know, the services architecture, you have the Documentum Foundation Services, which is below D2, and then you have a D2 layer for web services. And this enables you to interact with D2 web applications. So let's go to the next slide. Here's where you may want to customize. You have something special that needs to be developed where you want to display additional information within D2 in your application. Again, using the OpenAjax Hub and the JavaScript technology to create that web application. It can be used to manipulate iframe for within that D2 web app. Similar to what I said before, but you can create your own interface, your own business logic within these custom widgets, and we've developed a number of them for our customers. So we know that that architecture is solid. We've implemented it a number of times. And last here you have the D2FS API where you can leverage if you have interoperability requirements between systems that may not require an interface, but you want to generate documentation and you want to honor the D2 configuration investment that you may have. That's possible because the D2 web server, the FS Web Service API, will honor the D2 configuration model that you've created. So now you can have application users using D2 UI, and then you have downstream or upstream applications that are contributing to your D2 platform using the web service layer. So let's go to the next slide. And lastly, D2 plugins. I know we're limited on time, so I'm going to breeze through this. Again, it's really around deploying, creating and configuring these plugins, so you can generate your own plugins. It's basically generating, honoring the API interface contracts and deploying that onto your web server. And there's a number of technical details, which maybe we have a separate technical webinar talking about tips and tricks. That maybe that's a good idea for those who provide feedback. If that's something of interest, that might be another follow-up thing for us to provide. So let's go to the next slide. And here, I know I mentioned it in one of the questions on when I had the little cloud slide. So the answer is yes. From WebTop and D2, they can coexist. There are some considerations in terms of the data layer, the information or documents within the repository. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the ins and outs of these bullets, but they can coexist. A few things to consider, but they can operate within your one environment, one repository. So let's go to the next slide. And I wanted to touch on migration. For those who know FME a little bit, probably know of us from two things. There are Document, which is a utility for querying, administrative type of activity within Documentum repository. But our flagship product is Migration Center. So all of the information that you've heard today is great, but we also have to consider how do you get there from a data side. So if you're a brand new customer deploying new, maybe this topic won't be as relevant, but for those who are, have invested in Documentum, whether it be WebTop or other Documentum-based repository applications, and you're considering to go to D2, we have that ability. So we have a number of other capabilities, but for the sake of the webinar in the context of today, we do have the ability to migrate content from one repository or one repository, whether it's Documentum or not, into a D2 repository environment. And there's a number of details here, but let's go to the next slide. few highlights, just general highlights around Documentum, our Migration Center capabilities, just some highlights. We have the volume scaling capability. We are able to, we transform that information in a centralized way. We have a workflow, if you will, within our product to handle this processes, configuring metadata. We have real-time simulation. We can also do delta migrations. So a typical example would be I have a baseline migration and I'm going to cut over in 2 weeks. So when we do our baseline migration from one environment to the other, cutover weekend is just a small segment. So that's a major value add when it comes to a cutover process. Full auditability within our environment, and we have an open connectivity architecture for those customers that have special needs around data migration. It can be extended. So let's go to the next slide. Here's the workflow. I'm not going to go through each step. This is basically what we do within the software to process the data that needs to be to go from one source to target repositories. So let's go to the next step. Next slide, rather. So from a D2 data migration, things to consider. Some D2 features require, different attributing. So depending on where you're coming from and going to D2, things to consider. What's your data model look like? If it's the solutions, that's already known. I can speak to that, of course. But if you have an existing application and data model, needs to be reviewed and understood so that it fits, that data, that metadata, and that information fits into the D2 application configuration. So there's all of that's possible. It's just a matter of analyzing your source environment, understanding what the target D2 application needs to fulfill, and really mapping that across. And we honor, so let's go to the next slide, and the next slide, let's stay on this one, but the follow-up slide gives you a little hint on what we're doing. So the summary of that is objects, may not be adapted from one to one, so it may not be just a single one-to-one migration. There may need to be some transformation. So in order for me to fulfill my D2 application requirements, I need metadata in my old system, legacy application repository, retransformed, and we have that total mapping capability. So I'm not going to have time to get into all the details of that. But what you need in the end is automatically apply during that conversion process the D2 configurations that you've created and invested in for your application. So let's go to the next slide. So in summary, our D2 adapters, so can enable you or accelerate your implementation from a data migration perspective by supporting this path. We're able to migrate your data into the D2 environment, honoring auto-linking, auto-naming, the security life cycles, and this is actually is maturing as we're going, so we're adding additional capabilities as we need to. But we've already done a number of migrations with our adapters, so we're seeing very, very good success in enabling our customers to get that application to market, including the data side of it. So let's go to the next slide. So before I go here, which we can stay on this slide, things to note. So when we do the D2 conversion, we can migrate customers from repository X, which is, let's say, a Documentum 6.7 repository, and you're stood up a brand new 7X repository. We can migrate from source to target, and the target being a D2 environment. So that's one scenario. In addition to that, if you want to coexist within a repository, a web top application and a D2 application, and you don't want to move anything around, you're doing an in-place, if you will, upgrade, we can migrate your documents within your existing repository and scope it so we could segment that data set that should be D2 aware. We're able to target that data set, just to note. So here I'm going to breeze through these because we wanted to have a few minutes. I know we're getting to the end of the wire here, but these are, and again, you can come back to these slides. This will be available. We have one example here, D2 application around medical inquiries. There's a lot more between the lines here. I didn't have enough time to really get through it, but that's one scenario. The second one is a customer that has adopted Q&M and the R&D. And the last one, I don't have time to go through them all in detail. Let's go to the last one, is a perfect example of a financial service insurance customer that has XCP, WebTop, D2 all coexisting, and we've been able to implement D2 within that complex environment, having it coexist with the other technologies. So I think that concludes my segment, and thank you all who stuck with us for the duration of the webinar.
Thanks, Frank. We're obviously we're running over time, so we'll keep the Q&A part fairly short. We do have a lot of questions, and the questions that we do not get to, we will answer offline for you. Just real quickly, these are some upcoming ECM webinars that are part of our webinar series with FME and EMC. You can learn more about those on the FME or nChoice website. Okay. Also, I should mention that you will receive a link to the recording of the webinar within 24 hours, so sometime tomorrow you'll receive that. Okay, we're just going to cover a couple of questions. All right, the first question I have here is, what is the difference between D2 and XCP2.x? Let's say if we are upgrading a WebTop app, is it better to move to D2 or WebTop?
So Patrick, do you want to take that, or you want me to?
Yeah, I think you know, the way I would look at it is really dependent upon what you're actually trying to solve. You know, if you've got something which is a really highly orchestrated set of directions for the user, you know, very complex in terms of integrations and that sort of thing, then XCP might be better for you. But if you're looking for something where you're providing, if you like, fixed content or active content, and it's sort of that library metaphor, then D2 is probably the right one for you. So, you know, you can kind of accomplish many of the same things using both tools. But what we find is that the chances of success are actually better when you lead the discussion by what the use case is rather than by assigning a product to a generic WebTop replacement, for example. Frank, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point, where you have heavy content-centric activity, you know, D2, I would lean towards D2. That's my personal opinion. Whereas you have more process-centric, where I have workflow, heavy workflow or case management. I mean, a claims process is a classic example. But you can have, where you have more workflow interoperability with metadata, like business rules within a process flow, XCP lends itself far better in that use case. But you could do, you know, content-centric activity within an XCP application. But I would lean towards D2 if it was the classic document management use case, content, you know, contribution, consumption, and basic workflow review and approval. And if your application is more case-based or workflow process-based, then I would lean a bit more to XCP. And again, they could coexist in the same repository, and there's ways to have the best of both worlds.
Okay, thanks. Can D2 handle extensive workflows?
Yeah, this is Patrick. Yes, it can, but again, to me, it kind of primarily depends on what it is you're really trying to accomplish and what the major part of the use case is. So, for example, we showed a workflow widget, which can be included in the D2 workspace. So yeah, you can, but I mean, again, it really depends on, am I doing something that's case-oriented? Am I doing something where I really want the system to dictate my interaction with it, and in which case you're probably looking towards an XCP type solution. And they can coexist, as Frank was saying.
All right, the next question we have here is, does the user need admin access to his system in order to use D2 drag and drop? In WebTop, it requires admin access to register the drag and drop plugins.
I would say that's not, you don't need to be an admin to do that. So, you know, that's a basic user configuration to do drag and drop. There's no special needs from a D2 perspective there, other than local, applet. It does have an applet, but from a Documentum application perspective, you don't require sysadmin or administrative rights to do that function, to perform that capability.
Thanks. All right, Patrick, this question, it looks like it's for you. Do you see a lot of organizations moving from WebTop to D2?
Yeah, we actually do. I think the reasons for doing so is kind of interesting. We do have a number of folks that are sort of recognizing that WebTop as it stands is function complete. We're not really putting a lot of new functionality, end user functionality into WebTop, and most of the efforts are making sure that for our existing WebTop customers that the platform is secure and meets all of the coexisting platform certifications and so on. But we are really seeing some quite significant interest in moving to D2, not just for the sake of the user interface, but for the ability to sort of really reinvigorate and drive adoption of a standard process. So, yeah, we're seeing a lot of interest, and I think some of the challenges that we see are often, well, how do I move from my current to my new, and can I think about doing that now because it seems kind of overwhelming, which I think is where Frank's migration solutions, for example, play a really important and empowering role.
All right, thank you. All right, with workflows, we can send multiple documents for approval now. So what's the big change in D2, or how is it different now in D2?
Well, I think the difference there is that, if you decide to say, right, well, I've got 5 documents that need to be approved, that's one task, and when that one task is processed, that applies that approval to those 5 documents. So generally, it's the ability to create that kind of approval collection, if you like, and route it underneath the guise of one approval or one acknowledgement type step.
Thanks. Okay, we have time for one more question here. Frank, this sounds like it's for you. What do people see as the obstacles in moving to D2 from a data migration perspective?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit in the slides, but I think, when folks are looking at, their environment, they seem to be overwhelmed. I have all this data. I have hundreds of thousands of records that are, based on a WebTop application and historical data model. And how can I get there? How can I get that over to D2? There's the application layer, which I have to consider, and then, oh my goodness, I have all this data to deal with. So, that's where our sweet spot is. That's the gap we fill, at FME. So we're able to bring, software to the table to perform that. So it's really, let's say, ease the minds, or at least fill that void where it's not overwhelming. Whether you do it, with FME software, or for that matter, you may do it in place where you may need to do some data modeling adjustments. It's all possible. It all depends on what the outcome you're looking for. But again, this is something that's been done before, just to ensure that in the folks' minds. We've done it. Other partners have done it. Don't let the data migration side of the story really hold you back. And if there's any, detailed discussion that you would like to have with myself or Patrick or others within EMC, definitely reach out. We can discuss those for sure.
Hey, could I add to that? I used to be an IT manager responsible for managing content systems, and we also looked at migration as a huge chore. But I think if you've got to be able to balance that huge chore and huge obstacle for what you can really accomplish with the migration. And we've seen such a reinvigoration in some of our customers and a drive of greater adoption by doing these migrations that if you're bounding your argument by, it's going to take us a lot to do the migration, and then we're going to have to do training and everything for the new user interface, and you're not including, you know, what are the things that are really providing us problems? Are we having problems because people can't find things fast enough? Are we having issues where we're getting hit by audit because we're not being able to show our you know, proof that we've actually provided those process steps? So I think part of the challenge sometimes is many of the conversations about that are driven by IT, who sometimes don't have the full you know, benefit side of doing the migrations either, which can actually kind of change the nature of the conversation and change the project as well. Anyway, 2 cents.
Thanks, Patrick. All right, thanks, Patrick and Frank. We've actually, as you know, we're already over time, so we don't have any time for more questions. However, the ones that we did not get to, as I mentioned earlier, we will touch base with each of you individually to make sure you get the answers that you need. As mentioned, you will receive an email with a link to the recording within 24 hours. And thanks for joining us, and have a great day.